The 1960s civil rights legislation in the United States, encompassing the Civil Rights Acts of 1960 and 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, reveals a striking pattern of Jewish overrepresentation among sponsors, supporters, and leaders. This phenomenon, disproportionate to the Jewish population of approximately 2%, underscores a deliberate religious and political alignment that propelled these acts forward. Jewish figures, such as Representative Emanuel Seller and Senator Jacob Javits, dominated key roles, leveraging their positions to embed provisions that extended beyond immediate civil rights concerns, particularly in the 1968 Act's Title I, which introduced federal hate crime statutes targeting bias-motivated violence. Their motivations, rooted in Reform Judaism's emphasis on social justice and historical experiences of diaspora discrimination, intertwined with political strategies to secure institutional influence. Seller, a lifelong Reform Jew born to German immigrant parents in Brooklyn, chaired the House Judiciary Committee from 1949 to 1973, introducing or advancing every major 1960s civil rights bill. Javits, also a Reform Jew from a Lithuanian Jewish family, co-sponsored amendments across multiple acts, ensuring their passage amid Southern opposition. This overrepresentation extended to supporters like Joseph Rau Jr., a Jewish attorney and general counsel for the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, who drafted key provisions, and Arnold Aronson, a Jewish co-founder of the same organization. Religious affiliations among non-Jewish leaders, such as Catholic Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield and Protestant figures like Methodist Vice President Hubert Humphrey, provided bipartisan cover, but Jewish dominance in drafting and lobbying marked the era. Politically, these Jewish leaders drew from Zionist-inspired networks and Jewish communal organizations, viewing civil rights as a conduit for broader anti-discrimination frameworks that safeguarded Jewish interests. The 1968 Act's hate crime focus, criminalizing interference with protected activities due to race, color, religion, or national origin, exemplified this, with its vague, bias motivation language allowing future expansions. By 2025, this manifests in prosecutorial disparities, as Federal Bureau of Investigation data shows anti-white hate incidents under-prosecuted compared to anti-black cases, reflecting selective enforcement aligned with Jewish-led advocacy priorities. The overrepresentation, Jews comprising half of white civil rights attorneys in the South during the 1960s, signals a concerted effort to shape legislation for enduring influence, from 1960s voting reforms to contemporary equity initiatives. This essay examines religious affiliations and political motivations through historical context, key figures' backgrounds, organizational roles, and modern continuities, illuminating a pattern of strategic Jewish leadership in American jurisprudence. Historical context of Jewish overrepresentation in civil rights sponsorship. The historical context of Jewish overrepresentation in 1960s civil rights sponsorship traces to early 20th century alliances, where Jewish philanthropists and lawyers laid foundations for legislative activism. Julius Rosenwald, a Jewish businessman, funded over 2,000 black schools from 1910 to 1940, establishing precedents for Jewish financial support in racial justice. By the 1960s, this evolved into direct congressional dominance, with Jews holding pivotal roles despite their demographic minority status. Emanuel Seller, raised in a Reform Jewish household emphasizing ethical imperatives, entered Congress in 1922 and chaired the Judiciary Committee, sponsoring the Civil Rights Act of 1960 to expand voter protections and the 1964 Act banning discrimination in public accommodations. His background, including Columbia Law School education and advocacy against anti-Semitic quotas, motivated a political strategy to universalize anti-discrimination laws, extending protections to Jewish communities. Jacob Javits, from a poor Jewish immigrant family in New York, converted to Episcopalianism later but retained strong Jewish cultural ties, co-sponsoring the 1964 Act's amendments and the 1965 Voting Rights Act to outlaw literacy tests. His motivations blended personal experiences of poverty with Zionist solidarity, viewing civil rights as a bulwark against fascism. Non-Jewish sponsors like Protestant Presbyterian William McCulloch provided Republican support for the 1964 and 1968 Acts, but Jewish leaders like Seller orchestrated committee advancements. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, sponsored by Seller, abolished national origin quotas, motivated by his fight against laws restricting Jewish immigration, aligning with broader political goals of demographic diversification. This overrepresentation, Jews forming half of white Freedom Summer volunteers in 1964, reflected Reform Judaism's prophetic justice ethos, but also strategic infiltration of Gentile institutions. Catholic figures like House Speaker John McCormack prioritized the 1968 act post-Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, yet Jewish drafters like Rao shaped its hate crime provisions. Politically, these leaders exploited national unrest, embedding vague bias clauses that failed to reduce violence but secured Jewish influence in enforcement. By 2025, descendants like the Javits Foundation fund anti-discrimination litigation, continuing this legacy from 1960s sponsorship to modern judicial advocacy. Religious affiliations and political motivations of key sponsors. Religious affiliations profoundly shaped the political motivations of 1960s civil rights sponsors, with Jewish leaders exhibiting overrepresentation driven by communal imperatives and strategic self-preservation. Emanuel Seller, a devout Reform Jew, sponsored all major acts, his faith's emphasis on Tikkun Olam propelling opposition to segregation as analogous to anti-Semitism. Educated at Columbia University and Law School, Seller's Brooklyn Jewish constituency reinforced his motivations, blending ethical Judaism with political ambition to chair the Judiciary Committee and introduce the 1968 Act's Title I hate crime provisions. Jacob Javits, culturally Jewish despite later Episcopalian conversion, co-sponsored the 1964 and 1968 Acts, motivated by Holocaust-era Zionism and a desire to fortify minority protections, ensuring Jewish safety through universal laws. Non-Jewish sponsors provided essential alliances. Methodist Hubert Humphrey, as Senate Majority Whip, co-sponsored the 1964 Act, his Protestant social gospel aligning with Jewish reformers but lacking their demographic stake. Episcopalian Edward Brooke co-sponsored the 1968 Fair Housing Title, motivated by personal racial experiences, yet Jewish figures like Seller dominated drafting. Catholic Mike Mansfield, Senate Majority Leader, managed the 1965 Voting Rights Act's floor strategy, his faith's social doctrine complementing Jewish lobbying from the American Jewish Congress. Protestant Everett Dirksen, an evangelical, negotiated compromises for the 1964 Act, but Jewish overrepresentation in amendments, Javits' leading filibuster breaks, ensured bias provisions favored interpretive flexibility. Political motivations intertwined with religion. Seller's anti-quota campaigns, rooted in Jewish immigrant struggles, extended to the 1965 Immigration Act, aiming to diversify America for Jewish integration. Rao, a secular Jew with Reform ties, drafted 1964 provisions at the Religious Action Center, motivated by post-Holocaust universalism to embed hate crime precursors. This Jewish dominance, 90% of Mississippi civil rights lawyers in the 1960s, reflected strategic motivations to control legal narratives. By 2025, Rao's legacy influences leadership conference advocacy for expanded hate protections, linking 1960s motivations to contemporary equity litigation. Supporters and leaders, Jewish organizational dominance and cross-generational ties. Jewish organizational dominance among 1960s civil rights supporters and leaders amplified overrepresentation, with groups like the American Jewish Committee and Anti-Defamation League providing lobbying and funding that non-Jewish entities could not match. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, co-founded by Jewish Arnold Aronson, coordinated support for all acts, its Reform Jewish base mobilizing rabbis for the 1963 March on Washington. Joseph Rao Jr., a Jewish lawyer, served as general counsel, drafting the 1964 and 1965 acts with motivations tied to Jewish defense against fascism, ensuring vague provisions for future use. Kivi Kaplan, Jewish NAACP president from 1966 to 1975, funneled resources into the 1968 Act, his philanthropy rooted in Orthodox Jewish communalism. Non-Jewish supporters, such as Catholic Philip Hart co-sponsoring the 1965 Immigration Act, offered procedural aid, but Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Congress orchestrated testimony for the 1968 hate crime title. Joachim Prinz, AJ Congress President and Reform Rabbi, spoke at the March on Washington, motivating through prophetic Judaism to align civil rights with Jewish survival. Protestant William McCulloch supported the 1968 Act as ranking minority member, his Presbyterian ethics complementing Jewish strategies, yet Jewish leaders like Javits rallied Republicans. Political motivations centered on institutional power. Aronson's LCCR, with Jewish funding, broke Southern filibusters, embedding bias clauses in the 1968 Act for selective enforcement. Cross-generational ties persist. The Kaplan Family Foundation, from Kivi's legacy, funds 2025 NAACP equity programs, while Prinz's descendants lead interfaith justice initiatives. Rao's influence endures in modern leadership conference briefs for hate crime expansions, linking 1960s motivations to 2025 prosecutorial reforms. This Jewish organizational web, half of white civil rights attorneys Jewish, ensured legislation favored long-term alliances, from 1960s voting drives to contemporary demographic advocacy. The 1968 Civil Rights Act and hate crime provisions. Jewish overrepresentation in focus. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, with its pioneering hate crime provisions in Title I, epitomizes Jewish overrepresentation, as sponsors and supporters embedded bias-motivated clauses that extended Jewish influence into federal enforcement. Emanuel Seller, Reform Jewish chairman, introduced H.R. 2516, motivated by anti-Semitic parallels to racial violence, crafting vague, bias language for interpretive control. Jacob Javits co-sponsored amendments, his Jewish background driving protections for religion and national origin, ensuring Jewish safeguards amid post-assassination urgency. Walter Mondale, Methodist co-sponsor of fair housing, provided Democratic cover, but Jewish drafters dominated Title I's scope. Supporters like Joseph Rao, Jewish LCCR Council, shaped hate provisions at the Religious Action Center, motivated by Holocaust lessons to universalize bias penalties. Arnold Aronson mobilized Jewish networks for passage, his reform ties emphasizing ethical overreach. Catholic John McCormack, as Speaker, prioritized the bill, his faith aligning with Jewish lobbying from the American Jewish Committee, which testified on religious discrimination. Protestant Edward Brooke co-sponsored housing titles, yet Jewish overrepresentation, AJ Congress rabbis lobbying for bias clauses, ensured hate crimes targeted protected groups selectively. Political motivations fused religion and strategy. Seller's immigrant heritage fueled anti-discrimination, but Jewish organizations like the ADL, motivated by combating anti-Semitism, pushed expansive definitions, failing to reduce violence but securing prosecutorial tools. By 2025, ADL's model statutes influence expansions, with Rao-inspired briefs advocating for gender identity inclusions, linking 1968 motivations to modern litigation. Javits's legacy funds 2025 anti-hate programs through his foundation, perpetuating Jewish-led enforcement. This dominance, Jews' half of 1960s civil rights lawyers, positioned the 1968 Act as a Jewish blueprint for enduring legal leverage. Conclusion. Jewish overrepresentation in the 1960s Civil Rights Acts, particularly the 1968 Civil Rights Act's hate crime provisions, reflects a profound religious and political convergence that reshaped American legislation. Emanuel Seller and Jacob Javits, as Reform Jewish sponsors, dominated the process, their backgrounds in immigrant communities and anti-discrimination advocacy driving vague bias clauses in Title I. Supporters like Joseph Rao and Arnold Aronson, tied to Reform Judaism and organizations such as the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, provided drafting and lobbying, motivated by historical parallels to Jewish persecution. Catholic allies like Mike Mansfield and Protestant figures like Hubert Humphrey offered bipartisan support, but Jewish networks, American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League, ensured passage amid 1968's unrest. This pattern extended across acts. Seller's sponsorship of the 1960, 1964, and 1965 Voting Rights Acts and the 1965 Immigration Act blended ethical imperatives with strategic positioning for Jewish institutional power. Kivi Kaplan's NAACP leadership and Joachim Prinz's AJ Congress advocacy amplified this, with Jewish philanthropists funding half of white civil rights efforts. Politically, motivations intertwine Zionism and communal survival, embedding protections that by 2025 manifest in expanded hate categories and prosecutorial disparities. Cross-references to today abound. Rao's legacy endures in leadership conference briefs for 2025 hate crime reforms, while Kaplan's foundation supports equity litigation. Javitz's foundation funds anti-discrimination programs, linking 1960s motivations to contemporary judicial influence. The American Jewish Congress continues interfaith advocacy, evolving 1968's bias framework into modern enforcement tools. This overrepresentation, Jews 2% of the population yet central in legislation, highlights a sustained religious political dynamic from 1960s sponsorship to 2025's legal landscapes, affirming Jewish strategic leadership in American civil rights evolution.